Pessoal, bom dia. Então, nós vamos iniciar aí o webinar com os seminários de avaliação econômica em saúde do nosso curso de especialização em avaliação econômica em saúde da UnB. Queria agradecer a presença de todos e também lembrar que a gente vai gravar esse webinar, depois ele vai ser disponibilizado no canal indicado aí que a gente vai divulgar nas redes, vai ser o canal do curso. Provavelmente no YouTube, mas a gente depois vai divulgar para todos. Hoje a gente tem a presença de vários colegas aqui, então só queria me apresentar. Eu sou o Rodrigo Carregaro, docente da UnB, do curso de Ciências da Reabilitação e da equipe aí da especialização em avaliação econômica, junto com professores Ivan Zimmermann, do Departamento de Saúde Coletiva da UnB, e o professor Everton Silva, do Departamento do Curso de Saúde Coletiva da Faculdade de Ceilândia, da UnB. Está conosco aqui também a Jéssica e a Yara, que são alunas da especialização monitoras e da equipe aí do curso. E hoje, a ideia desse webinar é, conforme previsto no nosso curso, a gente tem um módulo de seminários em avaliação econômica em saúde, e dentre as atividades dos seminários, a gente previu algumas palestras abertas para a comunidade, e hoje a gente inicia com a primeira palestra, né, a primeira mesa da primeira turma, né? Nosso curso é novo, como todos vocês já devem saber. Então, hoje a gente tem a presença dos professores e pesquisadores aí, Mohamed e Alili, aqui dos Países Baixos, que atuam no Ministério da Saúde e na Vrije Universiteit, a Universidade Livre de Amsterdam, e atua na área de avaliação de tecnologias em saúde. E a gente queria agradecer também a presença do Jelle, Walraven. Eu vou pedir desculpa antecipadamente aqui se eu estou falando errado os nomes, mas eles já me perdoaram. Jelle Walraven, que também atua junto ao Ministério da Saúde na parte de regulação de preços e também na Erasmus, que é outra universidade aqui de Rotterdam, aqui pertinho de Amsterdã. A ideia hoje é a gente ter um espaço, então, para discussão da temática de como é feita a ATS, Avaliação de Tecnologias em Saúde, nos Países Baixos, né, no Ministério, e na sequência também abrir a fala para o Jelle para ele falar um pouco de como que é o processo de regulação e de conversas e negociações de preços com a indústria, né? Então, a ideia do webinar é a gente fazer as duas palestras, a gente vai ter uma duração aproximada de meia hora cada palestra, e aí, ao final, a gente abre para perguntas e discussões de quem está assistindo, né, dos interessados em fazer perguntas e interagir aí com os palestrantes. Eu preciso dar dois avisos aqui de organização, tá? Primeiro a gente vai pedir a gentileza de não abrirem as câmeras, e o que vocês quiserem fazer de comentário ou perguntar, basta usar embaixo do menu do Zoom, tem a ferramenta chat e o Q&A, né, de questões e perguntas, tá? E aí vocês podem ir ao longo das palestras aí fazendo as perguntas que depois a gente vai compilar e abrir para discussão, tá? Então a gente pede a gentileza aí de não ligar as câmeras para não afetar as palestras. E aí lembrar também que o evento possui a tradução simultânea, então para aqueles interessados em ouvir o áudio original, basta acessar o menu embaixo de vocês aí no Zoom, tem um globo escrito Interpretation. Basta ali vocês clicarem e vocês vão escolher se vocês querem o original, que é inglês, ou a língua portuguesa, e aí vocês vão ouvir a tradução simultânea dos palestrantes, tá? Então, vocês fiquem à vontade aí para escolher o que vocês preferem. Vou passar a palavra para o Ivan rapidamente, se quiser falar alguma coisinha, Ivan, e aí a gente dispara as palestras.
Vou ser bem breve aí, parabenizar pela iniciativa aqui dentro do curso, né? Todo um esforço do Rodrigo de trazer os colegas, e eu estou ansioso aqui para escutar, né? E conhecer novas experiências. Agradecer também aos inscritos, né? Que seja uma boa oportunidade de troca, que a gente tenha mais oportunidades como essa aí. Bom dia.
Legal. Mohamed, so thank you again for being here. Thank you, Jelle. So as we agreed, we could start with Mohamed if you would like to put your slides. So the floor is yours. So we're kind of anxious to hear you guys a little bit. And then after the lectures, we can discuss the topics. Thanks. That's it.
Could you tell me, Rodrigo, whether you can see my slide?
Yeah, we see you fine. So yeah, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Rodrigo and others for inviting us, me and Jelle, to tell you something more about our Dutch HTA system. I think the two of us inviting the two of us is actually a very good approach, since I think we will have talks that follow one of each other. So the first part is to see how we do our assessments, how we do look at effectiveness and cost effectiveness, and based on that, these reports go to Jelle and his colleagues, and Jelle and his colleagues eventually make sure that the drugs and other types of technologies can get to the patient. My name is Mohamed. I work at the National Healthcare Institute, which is the Dutch HTA agency. And I also work 1 day per week as a postdoc at the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam, where Rodrigo and I are colleagues. And I work on various topics: methodology of economic evaluations, teaching students, supervising master and PhD students, and so on. But before really digging into how we do this Dutch reimbursement, how we look at our dossiers and our pharmaceuticals within the Dutch system, I would like to ask you a question, and I understand you cannot answer this question, and I'll do it for you. So my first question is, whoever did buy something and you actually knew beforehand that it didn't work? And I use this example. I am guilty of it. I bought sometimes some stuff that I knew beforehand it was too good to be true. And this is exactly just such an example. It is an exercise band that you put on your belly. And within a couple of weeks, you can expect to have these abs of this supermodel. But unfortunately, we all know it is too good to be true, because you have to change your diet, you have to sleep well, you have to exercise, and so on and so forth. But now, imagine a situation where you know the product doesn't work, you pay for it, and you give it to someone else. That is really weird, right? You buy something that you know that doesn't work, and you give it to someone. And exactly this disappointment is what the National Healthcare Institute is trying to avoid. Within the execution of healthcare, we only want stuff, we only want products, we only want technologies and pharmaceuticals that are proven to be effective. We don't want to pay for something that doesn't work and then give it to our citizens and give it to our patients. So this misalignment is one of the core tasks for the National Healthcare Institute to avoid within healthcare. And our core task eventually means, in other words, to compile the basic health insurance package. So we advise the Ministry of Health about which products should be included within this basic health insurance package. In the Netherlands, we have a system based on solidarity. So every one of us, every citizen is entitled to pay a premium fee. And it doesn't matter whether young or old, rich or poor, sick or healthy, everyone is entitled to receive good care. And we can show that we have a solidar system, and by showing how that we spend these premiums that we gather from our citizens as optimally as possible. And optimally as possible means that we want to maximize our benefit, the health benefit of our whole population with the amount of money we have. So we need to make decisions based on the fact that we have scarce financial resources. Furthermore, other tasks of the National Healthcare Institute are, for instance, to improve quality and transparency of healthcare, encourage information exchange, and some other very important issues that, for today's topic, are less talked about, less discussed. So within the Netherlands, we have this health insurance package. This health insurance, before a certain technology of a drug enters this health insurance package, we have a number of package criteria that it needs to adhere to. So we have effectiveness, necessity, cost effectiveness, and feasibility. Since I have been working, and I'm still working as a pharmacoeconomic advisor, so I mostly look at economic evidence, the approach of the presentation for today will rather have a cost effectiveness focus, but I'll also talk briefly about the other criteria. So for instance, we have effectiveness, and that one is quite clear to understand. Does the new drug work better than the old drug that we already have in our package? Furthermore, we have necessity, and necessity refers to the fact whether patients have any other options available. What is the burden of disease of that certain disease itself, which relates to the cost effectiveness, because depending on what the impact is of a certain disease on someone's life, on someone's quality of life, we are willing to pay more or less to invest or to reimburse that certain drug. And then we have cost effectiveness, and cost effectiveness, actually the most important question we are trying to answer in this is whether the additional effects of this new treatment are worth the additional investments compared to other available treatments that we already have within our insurance package. And last, we have feasibility. Think about some simple issues such as, is the IT infrastructure ready to take up that new technology or that new innovation? Are physicians willing to prescribe that new drug? But also, how much does it cost? What is the budget impact? Do we even have the money to pay for it? And so on and so forth. So these are a little bit the way we think about, or at least the way we advise the Ministry of Health about whether or not to reimburse a certain drug. And I say we advise the Ministry of Health because we are actually an independent governmental institution that advises the Ministry of Health, where Jelle actually works. So Jelle and his colleagues receive our reports and continue their work on it. And they are also eventually the end responsibles, and they are the ones who actually say yes or no. We only advise and recommend something. But typically, in a sense, let's say 90% or even more than that, they follow our advice eventually. And Jelle can obviously correct me if I'm wrong. Regarding the reimbursement procedure, and if we graphically illustrate this, it looks a little bit like this. So the package criteria are actually incorporated within this figure. We first start the evaluation of a new drug or technology by looking whether it is effective, yes or no. And you can see we can only go two ways. It's either not effective or it's not effective and it's not reimbursed, or it is effective and we can go further down the flow chart. In other words, effectiveness is a knockout criterion. Remember the first example I gave you, we don't want to pay for something that doesn't work. We don't want to pay for fake products, for weird products. We only want to pay for products that are proven to be effective. The next step is we are going to look at necessity. Are there any options? But also, what is the burden of disease? What is the impact on the quality of life of someone? That relates again to cost effectiveness, because it depends, based on the burden of disease, how much we are willing to pay for this new drug. And you can see when we talk about cost effectiveness, we have multiple ways to go. It is maybe the new drug is not cost effective, but still there might be arguments to still get this or try to get this new drug reimbursed, even though it is too expensive in relation to what it delivers in health benefits. But also vice versa. It can be cost effective, but still there are substantial arguments not to reimburse. Think about some very cheap products for which a patient can bear the costs themselves. So maybe, I don't know, a pack of pills costs €5, $5 per month or something. Whereas very expensive drugs that cannot be paid by the patient themselves, and patients don't have any other options, I think, well, at least we as the government should think about ways to still get this drug reimbursed and get this drug to the patient. And these are actually the arguments that can be in place. I wanted to take you through a very brief example, although I've heard from Rodrigo that you're quite familiar with the field of health economics and economic evaluations. But just very quickly, as a brief recap, I'll take you to the concept of the QALY and the ICER and so on and so forth, and then we'll continue with the assessment procedure. So let's imagine we have two procedures that we want to compare. We have this considers a situation where a patient has kidney stones, and there are two options to deal with this kidney stone until this gets either removed surgically or it can be, well, I don't know how to say it, peed out by the body. So we have an innovation, which is a double J stent, and that is actually a minimally invasive procedure where you, through the urethra, you put in some sort of stent to actually drain the kidney into the bladder. And the old option was to use a catheter bag where you actually punch a hole through the body into the kidney and you have this bag next to your body. So we can imagine that perhaps this double J stent might be more minimally invasive, but also, even though it might be a little bit more, well, it might have some impact on the comfort of the patient. But imagine this situation like this. Then we have the QALY. And the QALY is actually the most important outcome. The quality adjusted life year, the most important outcome we look at, well, one of the most important outcomes that we look at within our economic evaluations. And it combines both the quantity and quality of life. And in the Netherlands, we have a value set where, based on these 5 dimensions that are scored, for instance, 1, 2, 3, 3, we can translate it into a utility value of 0.58, for instance, and then we can calculate the QALY at different time, the utilities at different time points. And based on the area under the curve method, we can calculate the QALYs. In this situation, we see, for instance, technology A versus technology B, where, the red squares are without technology and the blue square is with the new technology. And you can see that the new technology results in an improvement of quality of life, but also extension of life. So the death is moved further, and also the health values are a little bit higher. Now imagine and then we come to the most important outcome of an economic evaluation, which is the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. Imagine the new intervention costs 8,000 euros more, but also results in 0.12 QALYs more. That gives us an ICER of 66,666 euros per QALY. And in other words, to gain one QALY, around 66,000 euros has to be invested in the double G catheter as compared to the nephrostomy catheter, which is the old one through the bed. So a number of benefits of the QALY is that it allows comparison between different disease areas because you express the quality of life within one generic outcome measure. And it also allows for sorting intervention, choosing the intervention that maximizes population health. Well, regarding the assessment procedure, typically we receive dossiers from the manufacturers where they claim an added value of their new drug compared to the old drug. So typically this consists of a pharmacotherapeutic report, a budget impact analysis, and a pharmacoeconomic report. And the pharmacotherapeutic report is where effectiveness is being discussed. The budget impact analysis is where the budget impact is being discussed, and the pharmacoeconomic report actually considers cost effectiveness analysis. So when it is submitted, we look at it and then we write our reports, and then we go to the first scientific advisory board. And the scientific advisory board consists of a number of experts within the field within the clinical field, but also statistical field, health economics field, that does some sort of quality assurance of our work. And they also find sometimes new issues that we have to discuss. Typically, this consists of academics or professors within the field of health economics, or clinicians, medical specialists in the field that have expertise about a specific topic. after this first scientific advisory board, we take their feedback, we incorporate it in our report, and then we send this report out to the manufacturer, but also the relevant groups, such as patient representative groups, physician associations, and we incorporate their feedback as well. Then we go to a second scientific advisory board, where we have incorporated all the feedback of the scientific advisory board, but also all the groups. And then we finalize the reports, and these reports sometimes go to a societal assessment, but not always. And after this societal assessment, or even before this societal assessment, if this is something that is not necessary, then this draft reports, definitive reports, go to the Ministry of Health, and then Jelle actually and his colleagues take over to eventually implement the reimbursement in practice, and they have different ways of doing that. In words, it looks a little bit like this. I briefly explained it already, but I will go a little bit more in detail on the different steps throughout the presentations. What is also important to realize is that we do not always assess cost effectiveness. So when we have something that is less effective than what we already have, we're not even going to consider it to include in our package, and we're not looking at the budget impact and not at the pharmacoeconomic analysis. When it's equal effectiveness compared to what we already have within our basic insurance package, we only look at the budget impact analysis. And in that situation, the budget impact should be neutral, which means that the new drug is not allowed to cost more than the old drug. And when it's more effective, then the manufacturer can determine a higher price, for instance, but obviously within a certain threshold, which I'll come back to a little bit later. I have an opinion about how HTA has been used in the last couple of years, the last couple of decades. It used to, well, that's maybe something for the discussion later, but when it's more effective, we look at both the budget impact analysis and the pharmacoeconomic analysis, except when these drugs, extramural drugs, so drugs that can be that can be given at the pharmacy, when the budget impact is less than 10 million euros and the costs per patient per year for this treatment with this new drug is less than 50,000 euros, a pharmacoeconomic analysis, a cost effectiveness analysis is not necessary. Well, briefly, a budget impact analysis, I am sure lots of you already know what it is, and it is a very simple calculation. The number of patients with that disease that are going to use that new drug times the cost of these drugs gives us a certain number, and this is actually what is going to cost to implement or to use this new drug in practice. That is the bite that will be taken from our financial resources. Why do we perform this budget analysis? It is very interesting and very useful to know what the financial impact is of using certain drugs or devices. What happens to our budget? We have a fixed budget, and sometimes we cannot lose that amount of money for a certain group rather than for another group, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, the number of patients, to know how many patients have this disease, what the cost per patients are, what the total cost per treatment are also very useful. It's a very useful information. And from what I've understood, the Ministry of Health really uses this data and information eventually also in the price negotiations with manufacturers. So after the budget impact analysis, if this budget impact analysis for extramural drug is high enough and the cost per treatment are high enough, or it is a drug, intramural drug that is being given in the hospital, we also look at the pharmacoeconomic part of the dossier. And what we actually do is we look at whether these cost effectiveness analyses have been performed appropriately. And we interpret the results. How uncertain are these results? Do we need more information? And throughout this whole process, again, there is an important role for the scientific advisory board that I briefly commented on at the beginning with the timeline. So when we look at the methodology of these cost effectiveness analysis, one of the first steps we do is to look whether they have followed our Dutch guidelines. Dutch guideline for economic evaluations in healthcare has been updated, the beginning of this year. It was published the beginning of this year, which was a process of approximately 1 year. We have added various recommendations, for example, what time horizon you should use, what perspective you should use, but also, for instance, how to calculate the lost productivity costs, which discount rates you should use for costs and effects, and so on and so forth. But also some more concrete recommendations about which parametric distributions should you use to extrapolate survival, and so on and so forth. So we also look at more statistical methods as well, although it differs from dossier to dossier. But when we look at model-based economic evaluations, we look how did they deal with missing data, what type of parametric distribution did they use enough number of simulations for the probabilistic sensitivity analysis. And model-based economic evaluations, we receive those in 95% of times, maybe even 99% of times, only for some devices and for procedures and programs will receive trial-based economic evaluations, and that's more statistical analysis of cost and effect data, empirical data. And there we also look at the methodology that has been used. Did they deal with the non-normally distributed data appropriately? Did they deal with missing data appropriately? And so on and so forth, which gives us obviously some sort of trust in the results that we have. So based on these methods, we obviously receive results and we interpret these results. And the most important result, the ICER, we actually lay against a number of reference values. And I call these reference values rather than thresholds because it does not necessarily mean that something will not get reimbursed if it's over a certain threshold. So it is not a threshold as in black and white, as for instance, NICE typically in England typically uses, but it's more some sort of a reference that we want to work towards. And in the Netherlands, we use the proportional shortfall method to calculate the burden of disease. And based on this burden of disease, we have a number of reference values. And we have here a classification of three groups with a low, moderate, and high severe, high burden of disease. And think about some sort of infection with the low burden of disease, some sort of kidney disease or diabetes within the moderate burden of disease, and think about more severe types of cancer for the last category in terms of burden of disease, for which we are willing to pay the most, 80,000 euros per. These numbers are also based on research within society where within Dutch citizens, they have performed an experiment and they've asked them, how much would you like to pay for your own health and how much would you like to pay for someone else's health? And obviously, for their own health, they would like to pay more than for someone else's health. From the top of my head, for their own health, it was around somewhere between 75 and 79,000 euros per QALY. And for someone else's health, it was around 50,000 per QALY. They changed it around and used it here as the reference values. And the 20,000 euros per QALY is based on the threshold, the reference value for the Dutch vaccination program. And to calculate this burden of disease, we take actually the lost QALYs divided by the remaining QALYs without the disease, and that gives us this proportion that we can see in the left part of the table. And it's easier to see it this way. So imagine a situation where we have a patient, a healthy person versus a patient with a certain condition. And we can see that if we use a proportional shortfall, we divide actually the lost QALYs, which are the striped area, by the total amount for the total QALYs for the healthy person, and that gives us this proportion. And we calculate this according to a calculator that has been developed by a Dutch medical technology assessment group, IMTA. and it's called the IDBC calculator, disease burden calculator, where we fill in the age of the population, the percentage of males in this population. And I think it can also be used for different countries, and they use general population data of mortality and so on and so forth to be able to give us this information. And when we calculate this, this gives us a proportion shortfall of 0.58. So in this situation, we would pay maximally 50,000 euros per quali, depending on obviously the age and the percentage of males. So now we know what we are willing to pay, what our maximal willingness to pay is. We can lay our ICER next to this willingness to pay, but again, that is not the only problem. We also want to know how uncertain are these results. Typically, we receive partition survival models, as you can see here on the right, relatively simple 3-state models, where based on survival extrapolation, we can model patients in each of these health states. But the problem in this situation is, depending on how far away these lines, these survival extrapolations lines, are from each other, the more uncertainty we have, the more the ICER can fluctuate, and which is now the most trustworthy ICER in this situation. Sometimes it's really difficult, especially if we have very short follow-up periods. This can also be illustrated within these graphs, the probabilistic sensitivity analysis and the cost of stability curves that we use to interpret the uncertainty around the ICER. But these can also vary based on which assumptions you make in the beginning. So we're really looking at these assumptions, the methods, the uncertainty, very critically to try to understand whether we could really believe the ICER and whether we could help decision making in a way to make the right decision. I mean, if depending on 100 assumptions and you change 90 of these assumptions and all of these ICERs remain below the willingness to pay threshold or reference value, I mean, you can be relatively sure that it is cost effective in the end. But if it fluctuates all the way, we need different methods to deal with this, which could mean more research, price negotiations, managed entry agreements, and so on and so forth. In some situations where we have lots of uncertainty, but also when it considers drugs that are very expensive, we go to a next step after we have written our reports based on all these things that we have done and written in our reports. And that is the societal appraisal. And remember, it does not reach this phase if it's not effective. And the societal appraisal is actually a public debate by the Insured Package Advisory Committee, and it consists of various experts. And not only statisticians or health economists or medical specialists are part of this group, but also, for instance, people that work in mental health are part of this group. We even have general economists, and we also even have philosophers that are part of this group, that all take a different perspective on whether or not to reimburse a certain drug for a certain group. And within this committee, actually, lots of parties are allowed to tell their story. So for instance, the patient representatives can share their views on that new drug. Typically, their story is, we don't have many options left, and we are really welcoming this new option. We do understand that it's too expensive, but hopefully you can reach some sort of negotiations or something, or some agreements with the manufacturer, so it can be still available to us. The manufacturer typically mentions that his or her drug is the best drug in the world and is worth the money to invest in it. And then we also have the medical specialists that also tell a story during this committee, where well, in general, their view is either we do see an added value of that new drug, but the problem is we also find it too expensive. Or so in some instances, they can also say the patients already have enough options. We don't need this extra options because it does not add a lot on top of what we already have, especially considering the cost. So this type of discussions are being held within this public debate, and everyone, actually every citizen in the Netherlands, is allowed to come to this debate. You have to register, but you can come to this debate and look how this committee discusses and gives recommendation. So we have a recommendation from our side, so the assessors, including a recommendation of this committee, and together they go to Jelle and his colleagues, and they use these recommendations to either form some sort of managed entry agreements, negotiate prices, especially when something is not cost effective, or still try to get it to the patients because there is no other options left. They can think about various options, and I think Jelle will give you a little bit more insight in what options are there. And to end this presentation, I wanted to give you a brief example of a dossier that we have performed in the past, and I think you might know this drug already. It used to be the most expensive drug in the world, Zolgensma, for the treatment of spinal muscular atrophy. And this is a disease where, well, untreated, the patients typically die because they miss a certain gene, and their muscle degenerate over time. Eventually, they cannot even breathe themselves because they cannot move their own chests to breathe, and they have to be put in a breathing machine and so on and so forth. And the manufacturer actually promised or really believes in the drug that with one treatment, these patients could live a longer life and a healthy life. But we did have a problem with that, since first of all, the follow-up period was relatively short, and there was lots of uncertainty. Especially extrapolating the results of a follow-up period for a whole lifetime, that brings a lot of uncertainty. And considering the price the manufacturer was asking, from the top of my head, it was 1.9 million euros per treatment, which used to be the most expensive drug, but nowadays I think we have a drug of around 3 million euros per treatment. I don't remember the name. So we eventually advised the Ministry of Health not to reimburse this drug unless there is some sort of pay for performance or some sort of managed agreement between the manufacturer and the Ministry of Health. So it did not get reimbursed. All over the news in the Netherlands. Patients even started crowdfunding for little patients and so on and so forth. And eventually the company, Novartis, did enter a managed entry agreement based on pay for performance. And eventually it got reimbursed. This little kid, Jamie, for this little kid, they started a crowdfunding, and the kid got treated, from the top of my head, in the US with the money that was gathered to this crowdfunding initiative. But eventually the kid did not survive. And again, this is very unfortunate, but it also shows that real life situations are sometimes very different from what we have on our table and that we look at and assess, especially when we consider that it is something that is worth millions and millions and millions of euros that can be spent on other patients, that can be spent on other situations, and so on and so forth. And this whole assessment procedure of this drug, which used to be the most expensive drug, was a Benelux initiative. So with multiple countries, we looked at this drug, and the idea behind this is that when you have multiple countries, you have a little bit more leverage towards these manufacturers to negotiate prices, to make sure that the drug comes to the patient. Well, that we as a society find it societally acceptable to invest in this drug in the end. And this used to be, well, this initiative is still in place and is used sometimes, which is an initiative with Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, but also Austria and Ireland. And to end the presentation, remember, effectiveness is a knockout criterion, but cost effectiveness is not set in stone. And eventually the whole assessment procedure and the whole recommendation is not as easy as just saying yes or no. Thank you very much.
Hey, Mohamed, many thanks for your interesting presentation about how it works in the Netherlands. I'm just speak some words in Portuguese for who is watching. Just yeah. Pessoal, apenas esclarecimento. A gente acabou de abrir o chat, tá? Vocês podem aí digitar certas informações, mas eu vou pedir a gentileza de que as perguntas, né? Quem quer fazer perguntas, use o Q&A, né? O Q e o A. Nós estamos coletando as perguntas, tá? E aí, ao final das palestras, a gente abre para discussão com ambos os palestrantes, tá bom? Então, só para deixar claro isso. Okay, so thanks, Mohamed. I'd like to invite Jelle for the presentation. Jelle.
Are you good to go, Rodrigo?
Yeah, do you want to project the slides?
Yes, yeah. Are they there?
Yeah, perfect. So the floor is yours. Thank you again, Jelle.
Excellent. Thank you for having me. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jelle Walraven. I work at the Dutch Ministry of Health as a policy advisor. In my spare time, I'm an external PhD candidate at the Erasmus School of Health Policy and Management. So I'm not a doctor yet, but I'm aspiring to be one someday. Let's see. Before this, I worked at a large multinational pharmaceutical company where I did exactly the same thing. So pricing and reimbursement. But now I'm trying to do this with a more positive impact on society as a whole. There's a couple of topics I would like to go over today. A quick overview of the Dutch Ministry of Health and the Bureau for Managed Entry Agreements negotiations within it, our healthcare system and how we try to curb prices for pharmaceuticals, the central challenge that we address every day. So why even go on and negotiate? I would like to give an overview of the process as a whole, present a couple of cases to show the diverse range of pharmaceuticals, contracts, and situations that we have dealt with in the past. And I would like to share my personal views on some of the challenges that I expect that we'll have in the future on negotiations. Okay, let's start off with the Dutch Ministry of Health as a whole. In the Netherlands, we have a parliamentary democracy, and we elect ministers that are in the end responsible for the entire department. Ours is the Ministry of Health, Welfare and Sports. The lady on the top left corner is Fleur Agema, and she's recently been appointed as our new Minister of Health. So this is us. We are the Bureau of Managed Entry Agreements, and there are some departments between us that I will not mention specifically. But what's most important here is that we, in the end, report to the Minister of Health, Welfare and Sports, which again is Fleur Agema. And she only has to answer to her own party and to the Dutch Parliament. But in the end, almost any decision made within the ministry goes through a chain of command, and eventually it's the minister that gets to decide. Every other person, including myself and those above me, only have an advisory role. The minister is the sole person taking decisions within the system. And there's a correspondence, mostly letters, debates, and to some degree the media, where the minister has to be responsible to the Dutch Parliament, thereby eventually to the Dutch peoples. Regarding the Bureau for Negotiations, or the Bureau for Managed Entry Agreements, we are roughly 12 people. We're currently recruiting, and we have a couple of basic tests where we monitor the healthcare landscape. We receive HCA reports from Mohamed and colleagues. We then prepare an conduct negotiations, mostly with large pharmaceutical companies that have an office here in the Netherlands. We do the contracting, the administration, and the financial administration, because there's a kickback system. I think I'll refer to that a little bit later. And then, of course, like I mentioned before, we as a ministry have to answer to Dutch Parliament, which means that eventually we'll be involved and we'll have to answer for our part in that. And we have a large ministry. We cover a broad range of topics, and sometimes we're also involved in these other topics. So we'll play an advisory role over there. The Netherlands is a relatively small country, but we have it's a wealthy country. So we have the benefit of having a very high quality healthcare system, which also means it's attractive for large pharmaceutical companies to launch their new drugs here in the Netherlands. Just as a frame of reference, I don't have the figures for 2024 yet, because we report these results 2 years after, once we have received the money. But back in 2022, the Bureau had 49 treatments under contract. If there would have been no deals or no managed entry agreements on these treatments, we would have spent over 1.5 billion euros on those drugs in the year 2022. And after we have put these treatments under contract, we have gained 531 million euros back. So that's roughly 30%, a bit more. That money flows back to the ministry, and we will then give that back to the health insurance companies, who will then lower their premiums to the patients. So in the end, all the money that's saved by the ministry is eventually savings for those people that pay insurance in the Netherlands. So regarding those people in the Netherlands, the Dutch have a relatively unique healthcare system. I think it's we have nothing like it here in the Netherlands, and there's some interesting contradictions there as well. So we are a relatively socialist country. I'm not sure if that translates well. Okay, but we have a healthcare system that's based on principles of solidarity. So we help out everyone, whether or not you're in need. Still, our entire healthcare system is funded by a private insurance company. There's 4 large ones, and everyone. So, for example, Mohamed, myself, my parents, my colleagues, we are mandated to have a insurance policy with one of these companies, and we'll pay an insurance fee each and every month. So it's compulsory. If you're not able to pay for it, then the Dutch government will step in and assist in the payment to the private company. So the market is dominated by 4 large insurers. There are some smaller ones as well, and there are some labels involved, so there are some options. But like Mohamed mentioned, they all have to provide care within the basic coverage package. So there's a legally determined minimum standard, which all these insurance companies, whichever one you contribute to, has to adhere to, which means that if you pay your premium on a monthly basis, or the government helps you pay your premium, then healthcare is essentially free. There are some small co-payments. Sometimes there's a small out-of-pocket patient expense, but in most cases, healthcare will be free. As long, of course, as it is included in the basic healthcare package. There are some other healthcare services, such as dental, or let's say the birth control, anti-conception after you're 20 years older, that are not in the basic healthcare package, for example, because we think, like Mohamed mentioned before, that patient could or should pay for this themselves. We have a very well developed HTA process and a very professional agency behind that. I think Mohamed has demonstrated that. And so for new pharmaceuticals, what is in and what enters this basic health insurance package is managed by Zorg Instituut Nederland. They assess these products, and then they will give advice to the Ministry of Health, and then we will try to adhere to that advice. When it comes to pricing, we have a a set of measures that we incorporate to, let's say, curb public list prices. Because again, we try to help as many people in the Netherlands as possible. We try to maintain a high level of care, but because we cannot simply increase the insurance fee every month or every year, we'll have to be careful how we spend our money. So there's two main systems that we use to curb or control the list prices of pharmaceuticals. These are the prices that are listed online in the Netherlands. They're publicly available to everyone. We have reimbursement limits for some treatments, for some products. And for all pharmaceutical products, we do external reference pricing. I did some Googling. I found the Brazilian healthcare system to be too complicated to grasp within 5 minutes. So I'm not sure whether or not you have a similar system, because it's part of my work and I have this cool slide, I will quickly demonstrate how we do international reference pricing here in the Netherlands. So the basic idea is that we are not willing to spend more than our neighbor. I'm not sure if you can see my pointer, but this small blue blur here is the Netherlands. And we base our prices on an average of 4 other countries, which is the UK, France, Belgium, and Norway. It's not that complicated of a process in concept. We simply check their public list prices. We take an average, and then we make that the maximum legal price here in the Netherlands. In most cases, that means that the pharmaceutical company that offers it on the market will make exactly the same list price as is legally allowed. There's plenty of reasons to do so. There's, maximizing revenue. It can be used as a means to stop exports. Doesn't matter. Most companies adhere to the maximum price. In the end, it's a spiraling system, because Belgium, for example, in their international reference pricing process, they reference the Netherlands, and we then again reference Belgium. So if these pharmaceutical companies don't apply some policies, there would be a negative price spiral, which brings me to the confident price curbing measures. Most large pharmaceutical companies are not willing to lower or change public list prices more than they would have to, simply to prevent a price spiral. That's why it's also possible in the Netherlands to have a confidential price agreement. And there's multiple. First of all, there's these managed entry agreements, which are conducted and contracted by the Ministry of Health, which is part of my job. Then the health insurance companies, which I've mentioned before, they can come together and do some negotiations as well. Those are done by what we refer to as the clean team, which I think is a very cool sounding name for a negotiation team. The individual health insurance companies also have the right for certain pharmaceuticals to do tenders and abatements, so they can select a product where they can get the best deal, so the best confident net price, and make that the only option available to the patients. This happens for insulins, for example. And then also hospitals or clinics have the right to make purchasing deals with suppliers, so they can see if they can get a better price by directly negotiating certain treatments that have not been negotiated by the ministry or the clean team, for example. As you can imagine, this can get very complicated, because you have all these separate parties involved, and they all have deals and payments going on with one another, which I found in the last year also makes our job much more complex, because there's relatively poor transparency in all the confidential deals that are being closed within all these parties that have the right to do so. So these are the, let's say, 6 ways that we try to curb pharmaceutical spending in the Netherlands. And the rest of my presentation, I'll focus on the managed entry agreements that are conducted by me and my colleagues within the Ministry of Health. I do not want to repeat anything that Mohamed has already mentioned, but I still want to get this point across clear, we make a distinction between inpatient and outpatient therapies in the Netherlands. Inpatient are those that you receive in the hospital, so they're administered in the hospital. Outpatient pharmaceuticals are those that you can get at a pharmacy, a local pharmacy, or one downtown or one in the hospital, and you take these pharmaceuticals with you for use at home. We apply all these treatments are basically eligible for incorporation in the basic healthcare package, which means that they could be insured. And for all of these new treatments, we do something which is called horizon scanning, which is done by colleagues of Mohamed, where they'll basically assess which new treatments are submitted to EMA, so which are likely to enter the market within, let's say, 2 or 3 years, and those that have the potential to cost the Dutch society, the Dutch premium payer, a lot of money, those are being singled out for HTA assessment. So if we go from the left to the right, for inpatient pharmaceuticals, we usually have an open access system, which means that if you come to the market, you'll essentially automatically be included in the basic healthcare package. Then on the right, for the outpatients, we work with a positive list, which means you have to be on the list in order to be insured. And before you can get on the list, Mohamed and colleagues will do an assessment. If it's an expensive new treatment, they'll do a full assessment. If it's treatment that already has, 10 similar treatments, or it's a biosimilar, for example, HTA assessment will be limited. We also have a system for inpatient pharmaceuticals with a high potential budget impact, which we call the LOC, which is a negative list. So all the inpatient pharmaceuticals are basically already included in the basic package, unless you're being placed in the LOC, which means, again, that you'll have to submit a dossier to Mohamed and colleagues, and they will do a full HTA assessment. Usually, it's only these locked therapies and some very expensive outpatient pharmaceuticals that end up being negotiated by the Ministry of Health. For some of the others, so that you see on the left and on the right, they might be negotiated by the hospitals or the health insurers, for example. And I think Mohamed has mentioned this before, but these are the lock criteria. So if there's 20 million involved in the entire product, or the pharmaceutical treatment could cost over 50,000 euros per patient for one single indication, it will be put in the lock for further assessment and potential negotiation. Okay, so why negotiate at all? The challenge that we're trying to solve, and I'll allude back, I had some experience as a market access manager, and I think I ripped this from one of the previous slides, where they define it as trying to maximize patient benefit while also considering the financial sustainability of the company and the healthcare system. That's the slogan that's usually being put on the whiteboard. What I found in my personal experience is that these companies try and tend to maximize their own benefit. And well, you have to have some consideration for the patient and the healthcare system as well. If not, you're threatening the existence of your company on a 5 or 10-year term. The number one principle, I still recall this being one of the first slides on my training deck, is that volume can never, ever compensate for price. So what these pharmaceutical companies will try to do, especially in more developed, wealthy markets such as the Netherlands, is to try and get the highest price as possible on launch. And this is basically the entire challenge that we're trying to solve. The company wants to get the highest price possible. We at the ministry, of course, would like to have the lowest price possible. The company will have a minimum price that they want to accept in order to put it on the market. The ministry has a maximum price that we're willing to pay so these treatments can reach patients. As long as the minimum of the company and the maximum of the ministry overlap, there's a zone of possible agreement. So that means that there's a price where we can get to terms that we would be willing to pay and the company would be willing to accept for the treatment to reach the patients. If that's not the case, there's no zone of possible agreement, which means that there will be no deal which means that the pharmaceutical company will not be selling in the Netherlands, which means that the patient will not be receiving any treatment, unfortunately. This happens very rarely, but there are instances where the local affiliate in the Netherlands will not get permission from headquarters to lower the price, so there will be no deal and there will be no patients treated. If you do have a zone of possible agreement, which in most cases is so, then there's one crucial element, and that's time. Because after Mohamed and colleagues are done assessing and they have advised this therapy to be included in the basic insurance package, but usually with a discount, then a long process will begin. And it's of course in the patient's and in society's interest for this process to be as short as possible. But from a financial point of view, it's in the interest of the company, but also the ministry, to take some time for proper negotiation, so you have a acceptable price. And this element of time is where we conduct our business. I'll give a quick glance of the negotiation process, and I've tried to summarize it in 5 basic steps. And usually there's some paper, some document involved, which is a little square, and then there is some judgments, some considerations involved as well, which aren't always formalized. But there's 5 steps. The first step is easy because Mohamed does all the work. We receive a ACA report, which is a advice to the minister, because again, the minister is the person that takes or that has the mandate to make a decision. So the minister's name, in this case, Fleur Agema, will be on the letter that contains the advice. It's an advice to her as the minister. And the report contains all the information that we need to advise the minister on the decision, from pharmacotherapeutic value all the way to the ICER, potential budget impact, as well as a societal appraisal. And we take from that the ICER, the conclusion of whether or not there's added or equal therapeutic value, and then there's a whole other range of information in these reports that we use to come to an advice. So once we've received the report from Mohamed and colleagues, we'll do some further research. We'll see for market dynamics, where will this be implemented in basic healthcare practice? What will be the practical application? And have we had similar cases or similar products? Because as a public institution, we try to be consistent in our decision making, also because as a public institution, we can be challenged in a legal setting. And in those cases, it's always good if you have a firm, consistent policy. This HTA report and this further investigation and preparation will all then be compiled into a mandate. And this is maybe the most important step in a negotiation. We'll again make a advice to the minister, because we have no mandate to decide, only the minister can, where we provide a summary of the situation and the report that Mohamed and colleagues have provided to us. We have provided our considerations, which are usually built on these market principles and this additional information. And then we ask the minister, we formally ask for a mandate, which can be an amount. So we can ask the minister whether or not we can negotiate for up to 20 million euros. Or it could also be a price where we say, well, the maximum you'd be willing to pay would be 60,000 euros per patient or per year or per indication. Would you be okay with that? We give the minister some considerations. This, of course, the patient impact, which is very important. We will make an assessment of whether or not there's political support for such a decision, whether societal support, and of course, there's the legal feasibility, and very importantly, the financial impact, because everything that enters the basic insurance package will be reimbursed, will be paid for by the health insurance companies, which means that it will eventually be paid for by all the people in the Netherlands. The minister then gets to decide whether, in this case, she approves or does not approve of this mandate. Usually the minister approves. So by then we will have a formal mandate to, for example, spend up to 60,000 euros per patient and 20 million euros per year. Once we have that mandate, we have an opportunity, or well, we have permission to approach the pharmaceutical company. We mostly negotiate in letters, so it sounds very exciting to be in the negotiation team, but it's mostly paper, it's mostly letters. So we'll send them an opening letter. Usually the ministry does that. We have a offer for a price or a spending cap, whatever you have. We then have a substantiation for that, usually based on, again, the report provided by Mohamed and colleagues. We will then also have some legal conditions to the deal. One very important one, for example, is confidentiality. The company is not allowed to share the price being paid. Usually they're the ones that appreciate this confidentiality most. We'll come to agreement on how long this deal or this contract will last. And there will be some next steps which are procedural and not that interesting. This negotiation can take weeks, it can take months, and in certain cases it can take years, all depending on the position of the company, whether or not there's a lot of uncertainty involved, and whether or not, for example, another treatment is already available. In most cases, however, we will eventually get to a deal. So the company and the negotiation team will have come to a figure that is acceptable to both. Then again, nothing will happen and nothing will be included in the basic insurance package before the minister decides. So after the negotiations, we go back to the minister with a result decree, where we again summarize the process. We'll summarize the negotiation outcome, and we'll summarize some of the implications. And then again, we'll advise the minister, especially when we have a deal, to take the deal, sign off on the deal, so this can be given to patients. This, in the end, still is all on the discretion of the minister. For example, if we do not have a deal within the mandate, let's say the company wants 80,000 euros per patient or per treatment, we do not have permission to do that. We only have a mandate for 60,000. That means we have to go back to the minister. And then we can either advise to stop negotiations and not have it reimbursed, or we can ask the minister to increase our mandate. Again, the minister is the sole person that can do so. So these are the 5 steps, and it can take from a couple of months after we've received the report to multiple years. When we do get to a deal, there's a lot of different forms that we can adhere to. They range from very simple to very complex. Mohamed mentioned, for example, the outcome-based contract for Solvensma. We have those where evidence is generated while it's already being reimbursed. We have price volume agreements, there's caps, there's semi-transparent deals. It all depends on the situation and what seems suitable, but also acceptable to the counterparty. One thing that I've learned in the year that I've been a part of the negotiations team is that sometimes it's just best to keep it simple. You have all sorts of forms, for example, a pay for performance that on paper sounds especially appealing, but which is very difficult from an execution point of view, for example. Okay. To provide a bit more feeling of the type of deals that we can come to and our considerations, I would like to give an overview of some of the treatments that we currently have or do not have under contract, and what the situation was like in the Netherlands back then, and how we try to deal with that situation. So I think an easy example would be we have groups of therapies. So there's multiple products, BTK inhibitors or PCSK9 inhibitors. And after new studies have shown that they also are proven effective in new indications, they of course would like to have reimbursement for those indications, which usually means that we're in a pretty comfortable position, because these treatments are locked, which means they're not automatically included in the package. It means that Mohamed and colleagues have done considerable work to fully assess the treatment, so there's relatively low uncertainty. Well, because we have multiple products and these are competing companies, all will be compelled to get to the market first. So they do not want to spend a lot of time on the negotiation, for example, and which means there's also oligopoly is what we call it in the Netherlands. I'm not going to try and pronounce it in English, but that's a strong negotiation. Then there's also treatments. For example, when cost effectiveness has been reassessed or when we have to renew the contract because it's expiring, where, for example, a treatment has already been included in the basic package before the lock was even invented and put into place. That's a very tough one, especially, for example, a treatment like myozyme. There's a very high burden of disease, which affects very young children. The ICER can be extremely unfavorable, going up into the millions per quality. But then again, there's no alternatives expected, for example. So you want to be able to still provide this treatment to patients whilst also knowing that the costs to society are, well, not acceptable, but also knowing that there will be no easy way of getting the pharmaceutical company to agree to a deal that's worse than the one they had before. We also have some more interesting and, let's say, dynamic contracts. An interesting example, for example, is the Nusinersen Spinraza, where after consideration by Mohamed and colleagues, it was found to be proven effective in a certain age group, while they were not certain yet for another. Where the ministry does not want to take the full risk, like Mohamed mentioned. It's going to be difficult to explain that we pay for something where we're not sure or not confident that it will work. So in those cases, we can, for example, have a conditional reimbursement where we'll have a contract. But in the meantime, more data will be collected from new patients in practice, either in the Netherlands or in other countries in Europe, and where we will have the opportunity to decide on reimbursement and a new deal later on. There are some joint negotiations. Mohamed already gave the example of Solgensma, where the assessment was also with Luxembourg and Austria, but where the eventual negotiation was done together with Belgium, Ireland, and the Netherlands, which also means that all these countries have to decide together whether or not they will take the deal or they will not take the deal. This was a very difficult case. It's an ultra-rare disease, which usually means a very high price. It affects babies and infants, which is a heartbreaking situation, of course. Politically speaking, these joint negotiations are very popular because you always think that because there's more countries, there's bigger volume, you will have more weight in the negotiations, but it's also more complex because you will have to align the decision making and all parties involved, not just in the Netherlands, but also Belgium and Ireland. One final example is a new treatment. So it gets approved by EMA, but because it was picked up in horizon scanning, it has been put in the lock, so to speak. So it's not reimbursed for patients yet. There's been a full HTA assessment. There's been found added therapeutic value. There is no alternative treatment, but the ICER is unfavorable. And I think in this instance, Mohamed and colleagues advised a discount or price reduction of 75%, which is substantial. It's not something that the company is easily willing to do. And in this case, like I've mentioned before, we have not been able to find a zone of agreement. So the maximum amount that the ministry was willing to pay was lower than the minimum amount that the company was willing to accept, which means no deal can be struck, which means that Trodelvy, as of this moment, is not being given to patients in the Netherlands. I do want to add to this that it's not a final decision ever. If we do not come to a deal, we can always come to a deal later. But there's also other possible routes. I think in the case of Trodelvy, the company has sued the Dutch government, so we have a court case ongoing. New evidence has been gathered, which means that Mohamed and colleagues can do a new assessment, which might come to new conclusions. And also we have a new minister. And again, the minister gets to decide which treatments get reimbursed. And even while the ICER can be unfavorable, the minister could still decide to start reimbursing Trodelvy, even though her predecessor has decided not to. So it's never the process is never over if you have no deal. If you have a deal, then the process is concluded because there's a legally binding contract. If there's no deal, anything can happen in the future. This was basically my talk. I do want to share some personal observations on what I think Eliza had for negotiations, just because I enjoy talking here. There's, I think, technical challenges that affect all countries. Brazil is no exception there. And there are some future societal challenges that I think do apply to the Netherlands, which also might apply to Brazil. There's enormous amounts of new treatments being approved by EMA every year. The indications tend to get smaller, which means there's fewer patients included in the studies. It's shorter studies, it's rare disease, single-arm studies, which in many cases means a higher uncertainty regarding the economic, but also the health economic outcomes, which makes it, first of all, more difficult for Mohamed and colleagues to give us an advice, but also for us to interpret and to execute that advice. Then, in my opinion, there's a large number of upcoming treatments in which a cost-effectiveness analysis as a whole has a lower feasibility. 2 weeks ago, there was a public appraisal of a new treatment where the ICER submitted by the company was 20-fold our maximum willingness to pay, which means it will in no way be cost-effective, but which also means that we would likely have to get a 90% or higher discount, and it's very unlikely that the company is willing to accept that. So there's going to be more treatments where the our maximum willingness to pay and the amount that the company wants to receive will not overlap. So there will be no zone of potential agreement on the deal. So that's going to be difficult in the future. And because we have a increasingly complex and intransparent system, it's going to be hard for us to make deals that last 3 or 4 years, because you never know what will happen in the future. For time constraints, I think I'll skip the future societal challenge in the Netherlands. I just want to conclude by thanking you all for your time. In case you're interested in negotiating managed agreements yourself, I think the most useful skills would be networking. I have a colleague who's a former colleague of Mohamed, Dr. Litran. She knows everything, she knows everyone, and if there's anything we don't know yet, she'll make 2 phone calls, and then we'll be in the loop. It's intelligence gathering, knowing what goes on in the market, but also being able to find information quickly, let's say on prices in Germany or assessments in other countries, and writing and presenting, because again, in the Netherlands at least, we can only advise the minister. So it's very important that you're able to present information and arguments in a clear and understandable way. If this is what you want to do with your life, and I've understood that there's all types of people in the audience. If you're still a student, I've done this myself, you could take up an internship at a pharmaceutical company. They're always willing to attract young people, especially if they have a background in HTA or policy or health economics. I'd also advise you to go work in government after, but you'll get some interesting experience and insights into how these companies operate. I found that many of my colleagues have in the past had traineeships or jobs in health-oriented consultancy firms, which again aligns with the role of being an advisor to the minister in the end. And then again, I think 5 out of the 11 colleagues in our team have some form of doctoral degree, either in pharmacoeconomics, pharmacy, or health policy. And that's a very valuable asset to have, because you'll be more able to, let's say, understand the more technical aspects, for example, in an HTA report written by Mohamed, but also have the ability to better interpret what that would mean for the ministry and for the Netherlands as a whole. So again, thank you for your patience, for your time, and I hope this has been insightful or interesting.
Thanks, Jelle. Thanks again, Mohamed. Nice presentations. I think it will be, we have plenty of time, around 30 minutes to discuss, so I have a lot of questions, but I think it's a nice interaction between our professionals working in the Brazilian Health Ministry with you guys. So I think, yeah, we have some nice aspects to discuss here. Just a quick reminder in Portuguese here. Pessoal, então, para os que entraram depois, a gente percebeu que alguns participantes entraram depois, a gente só queria reforçar, então, que é o webinar aí relacionado ao módulo de seminários do nosso curso de Avaliação Econômica em Saúde, a especialização da Universidade de Brasília. A gente queria agradecer aqui, deixar registrado o suporte fundamental do Ministério da Saúde, que fomenta o curso, né, e que permite esse tipo de atividade gratuita aí para todos da rede da Rebrates e dos NATs, né. A gente vai iniciar aqui, a gente tem várias perguntas no Q&A. Se vocês quiserem fazer novas perguntas aí, podem digitar, mas a gente vai seguir a lista aqui. Tem umas boas 5, 6 perguntas aqui que eu acho que vão dar um pano para manga, né, Ivan? Se você quiser também falar alguma coisinha.
Oi, bom dia a todos, né? Parabéns primeiro pelas palestras, né? Tanto Mohamed, Jelle, fiquei anotando muita coisa aqui, adorei toda a experiência, mas comentei com o Rodrigo, né? Vou me segurar porque a gente teve várias perguntas aqui. Mohamed já respondeu algumas, inclusive, né? Agradecer já essa participação. Eu ia fazer só um pequeno comentário, tá? Um comentário, uma dúvida, né? Especialmente da parte do Mohamed, e depois eu acho que a gente. E aí posso passar aí para umas perguntas, tá? Vou me conter aqui. Vou ter que me conter porque foi uma participação bem bacana. Eu acho que a gente tem que prestigiar aqui todo mundo que está assistindo. Mohamed, eu fiquei super interessado, né, na questão daquele índice de carga de doença, da aplicação dele. Estava comentando aqui até com colegas, com Marisa, do Instituto Nacional de Cardiologia, que a gente trabalhou junto na ideia de construção do limiar de custo-efetividade no Brasil. E um dos critérios que a gente considerou para ter uma flexibilidade no limiar foi justamente a gravidade, né? A consequência de uma doença tão grave, permitido ter um limiar mais flexível. Essa ideia do limiar ser mais uma referência do que uma barreira em si. Mas isso tem sido muito questionado, é uma grande dúvida, né, da sociedade de forma geral, como que a gente define o que é essa gravidade, como é que a gente varia esse parâmetro. E eu achei super interessante essa proposta, né, dessa relação de um indicador com essa carga de doença com a gravidade. Aí eu queria saber como é que tem sido a experiência, como é que tem sido a aplicação desse índice, né, e se tem sido bem recebido tanto pelo comitê, pela sociedade de forma geral.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for this question. And I noticed that typically when I give a presentation or a talk somewhere, almost every country has questions about this burden of disease and the reference values we use. Honestly, I feel that we in the Netherlands are quite used to it now. But from what I've learned from my colleagues that have been, that actually experienced the introduction of this reference values and this burden of disease in approximately, from the top of my head, 2012, between 2012, 2015, from the top of my head. And is that it was quite it was well received, but it also had quite a large impact on the health economic community. So to briefly answer your question, I am used to it. Lots of my colleagues are used to it, but discussion arises again. And the discussion that is taking place nowadays is that, are these reference values based on these three categories that we have still up to date? Should we increase them? Should we decrease them? And so on and so forth. I would like to refer you to a report on our website. Unfortunately, it is in Dutch. In that report, various ways of calculating the burden of disease have been discussed. And eventually the choice was made for this specific calculation, the burden of disease according to the proportional shortfall method, because depending on which one you use, you either favor older people or younger people, and the situation we have chosen to calculate the burden of disease now does not discriminate in terms of age. That was one of the major reasons to choose for this approach. The categorization from the top of my head, I cannot answer it right now. I have to look back how they made these categorization in these groups. But the levels, they are clear. The levels were asked within the Dutch citizens to determine these values, and they linked them with the groups. I'm aware of a study that has been performed, I think, by your colleagues at Erasmus, Jelle, Job van Exel. He and his PhD student have actually looked at whether these reference values are up to date and whether they should be changed or lowered. And what they actually have found is that we are still using the right reference values. So even though inflation around the whole world has been taking place, we usually get the question, shouldn't you correct these reference values upwards according to inflation? So make them higher. But apparently we as a society, as a Dutch society, over time did not want to pay more. And actually, if you take into consideration inflation, we are willing to pay less for health rather than 10 years ago. The specific details of the study, of the previous study and the current study, I cannot share with you, but I can share the report with Rodrigo and maybe get you in touch with Job, because that paper should still be published. It was presented during a conference, but it will get published in the upcoming year. I hope you answered your question a little bit about these reference values.
Não, perfeito, obrigado. Com certeza vou fazer o dever de casa aí, estudar, porque é algo que a gente está realmente precisando estudar aqui. Comentário que eu esqueci de pontuar, que eu fui um dos usuários aí do duplo J, tive um problema aí com cálculo renal e eu vivi aquela situação. E olha que o duplo J é melhor e mesmo assim ele tem um problema, viu, de desconforto, que é o que me fez sair do sedentarismo e nunca mais ter que enfrentar ele, tá só pontuando isso aí. Rodrigo, você que manda agora.
Legal, vamos puxar as perguntas então. Okay, so we have some questions for you guys. I think I'll start with the first one. Marisa Santos asked, I think was for Mohamed. When we were talking about those thresholds and some references values, you said something about less than 10 million euros. So the question is, how did you choose that specific threshold?
That is perhaps also a question for Jelle, because from what I've understood so far is that the government eventually every drug below 10 million euros is not that worth it to invest so much time and effort and resources and negotiations in. Hence, for those situations, relatively cheap treatments under 50,000 euros per treatment and maximum 10 million euros, no negotiations take place. So we don't need a cost-effectiveness analysis to determine a certain price discount, since the probability that these treatments might be cost-effective is high, although sometimes some companies also try to submit drugs without a pharmacoeconomic analysis and try to make a price to just get below this 10 million euros because beforehand they know the drug is not that effective. So in terms of cost effectiveness, it would be unfavorable. But from what I've understood, this value of 10 million euros is partly based on that the government actually does not necessarily negotiate about the prices or whatever when it's below 10 million euros. But perhaps Jelle can add to that.
No, that's a fair point, Mohamed. Usually that's a threshold Then if Zorg Institute doesn't assess it, we usually don't have a proper basis for our negotiations. But then again, there's other parties in the market, such as hospitals or insurers, that can then take over.
Nice, thanks. Please, Marisa and others, please just give us like a quick feedback if the question was answered. Some questions I would like to thank you, Mohamed, because Julia and other people that asked some questions, if you go back into the Q&A, Mohamed answered the questions. So I'll go for the other questions, and if we had time, we can come back for these questions. So Natalia asked, so the institute is not kind of closely related to the government, Mohamed?
It is very funny because sometimes myself, I don't understand it either. We are officially, in Dutch, it's called zelfstandig bestuursorgaan. So we are an independent organization that is part of the government, but advises the government. So it is, I don't know an example from the Brazilian situation, but officially we are an independent group of people that tries to work as independent as possible to give advice to Jelle and colleagues. Although we do have frequent contact and discussions about various stuff, especially what do they need from us in order to have successful negotiations, and so on and so forth. But we do our assessments of the drugs, we do them ourselves as independently as possible with all these committees that we have in place. And that goes actually to the Ministry of Health. And yeah, that's it.
So that's quite interesting. So I might say that because you are independent, perhaps, I don't know, you are kind of less influenced by politics, or at least, I don't know, interferences. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think maybe Jelle also has an opinion about this, but I think we are a little bit, we have quite straightforward tasks, especially when it considers assessment of drugs. It doesn't necessarily matter which government is in place during which time period, our task stays the same. We have to assess the drugs with these reference values, with these things, and that advice goes to the government. But depending on who's sitting there on the chair as the Minister of Health, Jelle has, well, eventually Jelle has to work with that minister, but depending on how that minister behaves and thinks, it can go different ways. Maybe you can add something, Jelle.
No, I think that's a good point, Mohamed. And the minister has plans for him or herself. That's why you become the minister. Then there's the party, and then there's the larger need and the answer. But Zorg Institute advises, and I think that that's well demonstrated by the fact that in some rare cases, the ministry does not heed or follow Zorg Institute's advice. So they're free to advise whichever they think is the best assessment, and then the ministry will always take that into consideration thoroughly, and will then act upon it separately.
And I think also the Ministry of Health is the end responsible, right? So we have an advice. The Ministry of Health are the ones who eventually are responsible to do whatever they want to do with their budgets, with their stuff.
Yeah, that's true.
Nice. We have another question from Alili. She's asking, how is the assessment for some conditions, for example, say cancer, in which we have one or more technologies or more interventions available in the market, and these technologies has some small differences between them. So she's asking, for example, you do like a network meta-analysis comparing all interventions, or both, for example, are included in subgroups analysis. How do you proceed in this condition?
This is also a very relevant question that has popped up lately. Typically, what we do, at least the last couple of years, is we always compare with the comparator that is in the same line, the same treatment, the same position within the treatment sequence, which typically is one of the latest ones. So we do not consider, so we consider the new one versus the old one, but we do not consider the older ones or the other types of treatments within the whole treatment sequence. That can form a problem because what we do, we keep looking incrementally. So eventually the costs will keep increasing compared to the old, because the old was expensive, then a more expensive comes, and then the old is expensive and more expensive comes. As obviously it has some sort of added benefits in terms of qualities, but these benefits are typically low. And if you divide by a smaller, well, you divide smaller costs by a small effect, it can result in a favorable ICER. But if you compare way back to the older treatments or the full scale of all treatments that are available, different results will arise, maybe even higher ICERs, because the costs are much different, because the older treatments are much cheaper nowadays. Maybe the patent has been expired and it only costs 10 euros versus 10 million euros. So what we have advised now in our new guideline is that we want to see a fully incremental analysis within the cost effectiveness analysis, because in the rules of cost effectiveness analysis, in a sense, you always have to compare with the most cost effective comparator. That is actually the most appropriate comparison that you make. But in practice, in the Dutch practice, we always look what is being used right now as the most used one and the most recommended one, and we compare to that one. Whereas if we want to do a fully incremental analysis, we have to take more comparisons into consideration. And in order to capture this, we have advised in the new guideline the manufacturers who make these models and do these analysis to give us, well, to perform a fully incremental analysis, including all the other options. And regarding network meta-analysis and indirect comparisons and so on and so forth, we also see these methods typically for typically for single-arm trials, where no comparator has been used, and they search various comparators from repositories, registries, and data, and try to combine them.
Okay, nice. The next question I think is for Jelle. Marisa asked why, if you can explain further a bit more about why volume does not impact the prices of the negotiations.
In some cases it does, because there's a list price which is submitted already in the dossier handled by Zorg Institute, and there's an expected number of patients, which means you have expected expenditure. And what we might do, you can imagine a treatment being near cost effective, so only a 20% discount is needed, but it would cost over 100 million euros per year. Then we'll still try to incorporate that volume to see, or if we're not sure about market share, for example, to build in some mechanic that if volume is higher than expected, for example, or higher than desirable, then the discount would go up. Or this could also apply to treatments that have various indications with varying levels of cost effectiveness, where we'll try to match those, for example. So volume is sometimes included, sometimes it's not, dependent on the situation.
Okay. One of the last questions here, they're asking if, I don't know, it's kind of interesting question, I don't know, but if there's some pressure on you guys from the pharmaceutical industry in the Netherlands, and what is the government support kind of to block or to protect from this pressure? I think that's happening worldwide, right? So yeah.
Yeah, that's a fair question. On a personal level, we don't experience that pressure, because in the end we meet with these companies, and it's in everyone's interest that we have at least a professional relationship, so we can try to achieve what everyone wants, which is the pharmaceutical being reimbursed. What I found, and I think I had it included in the slide, but I skipped that, is that now I think more than before, this is being thought out in the media and on social media. So I think on a very popular public television channel just the other day, there was another in-depth analysis on the reimbursement of some pharmaceutical, where there will be some information from independent parties, but where you can also distinguish that those parties that have a direct financial incentive are trying to steer the public conversation, but also the political conversation, which puts pressure on the minister, which then indirectly puts pressure on us.
Another question that popped up here is that how do you deal with, so for example, we have some health technologies that had the positive assessment. So these technologies are kind of followed up during the years when it comes to costs and benefits. Also, there are some price renegotiations. And how do you do like the, I would say, retirement of these technologies, older technologies?
Yeah, that's a. I keep saying I keep repeating myself. But that's a fair question. We usually have a contract for 3 or 4 years, unless, for example, there's been a reassessment, but those are relatively rare. I think there's been a discussion going on for years that we should do more reassessment, but there's time, there's need, and then there's the question whether or not it will eventually lead to a better price. But when there's a new contract and circumstances have changed, for example, a competitor has entered, or results are less favorable, or anything could happen, we might come to a new deal. The pharmaceutical company, of course, would not, in many cases, be interested in that. They prefer to keep the deal that they have, which is also fair and understandable. What's usually the point where we no longer get into a new contract once it expires is when competition has arrived that can be dealt with by the market. So, for example, there have been treatments like the BTK inhibitors and the PCSK9 inhibitors. They're still on a contract, despite there being 3 or 4 options available. But there's also other sorts of treatments where there's 4 or 5 competing treatments where we think that the health insurance companies or the hospitals would be equally or better suited to get a good price. And then, of course, there's the treatments where a generic or biosimilar competition enters. Then we no longer see any reason to prolong the contract, because then with tenders, the hospitals and the health insurers can get a very, very good deal themselves.
Okay. Marcia is asking, how do you monitor the volume of each drug, which is, help me here, Ivan, dispended? I don't know if that's a correct term. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. What we do is we don't, in the technical sense, we don't really get a discount because these are confidential. Everything is done on list price. So the company will sell practically for list price to the wholesaler, who will sell practically for list price to the pharmacy, who will then charge list price to the health insurance company. What happens is that we have a very, I think, decent information system. I mean, we're talking about pharmaceuticals here, so everything is registered in a central database. In the end, the Ministry of Health receives the amounts dispensed. And based on that, we'll make calculations on how much was, well, technically overpaid because, list price has been charged the entire time. And then we will send a bill, a fee, and then we will receive the money back from the pharmaceutical companies. And that's why I could only show you the figures for 2022 at the beginning of the presentation, because that cycle of receiving the information, checking the information, and then acting upon that information takes about 2 years.
Ivan, do you want to add something? Because we don't have any questions. I think we answered all questions. Perhaps we could look into 2 questions that Mohamed answered. Do you want to make some considerations about that, Mohamed? I think Julia asked about the value of information analysis, and Anna said something about also the analysis. I don't know if you want to synthesize what you answered to them.
I can briefly elaborate on that a little bit. So regarding the value of information analysis, this used to be voluntary. So when a company submitted a dossier with a pharmacoeconomic analysis to the National Healthcare Institute, it was not obligatory, but since January 2024, with the new updated guideline, and actually from now the summer on, companies have to adhere to this new guideline, value of information analysis has become mandatory. So before this summer, actually, it did not influence decision making. I also believe that it will not influence decision making afterwards in such a way, but it will add extra information for discussion in societal appraisal committees, the scientific advisory board, but it can also form a very good base for further managed entry agreements, because you could see what it costs further down the way if you are going to gather more data. Is it worth it to gather more data in order to see the value of that new information? So in a sense, it is extra information that can be used in practice, although I do not believe it will influence decision making in such a way that it will change the recommendations we make in practice. Perhaps not even that much with the government. I'm not 100% sure, but they can still use this information to do some negotiations, some managed entry agreements. And I also mentioned, Julie also mentioned the more practical question about standard reference costs. I think, Rodrigo, you have seen them before. This is this guideline, a costing guideline, where we have all these standard prices for physician, hospital stay, ambulance care, and so on and so forth, emergency care. So these prices were developed, made, and constituted in the year 2014, from the top of my head, or even before, I'm not 100% sure. But if you're using these costs in following years, you have to correct these costs for inflation. And in the Netherlands, we use the Consumer Price Index for it from the Dutch Bureau of Statistics that has information about inflation, and we increase the prices every year. So for instance, a physician consult could cost 33 euros in 2014, but nowadays around 50 or whatever. But also during the update of the current guideline for economic evaluations, we also updated all these prices, and also more prices have been included for different types of healthcare. But indeed, we correct these prices for inflation over time. Then the other question was from Anna, I think, about what we do with the phase 1 or phase 2 studies. Over the last years, Jelle also mentioned this during his presentation at the end. We have an increasing number of dossiers in which phase 2 studies have been used, where single-arm trials have been performed. This obviously increases uncertainty because we have to do indirect comparisons for effectiveness in terms of matched, adjust, indirect comparisons, network meta-analysis, and so on and so forth, but also in cost-effectiveness analysis, where they have to search for a certain registry or data registry and try to match it to the single arm in terms of IPD data, and then calculate the cost-effectiveness analysis. So all of these extra assumptions, extra analysis, on top of the already existing uncertainty around the effectiveness of the drug, makes it even more uncertain. And we do try to communicate that within our reports towards the Ministry of Health. We also grade the effectiveness studies according to the grade system. We already decrease the points with 2 points already because it is a single arm trial. So it does get penalized more if you have a single arm trial compared to a normal trial. And in cost effectiveness, we are very, very uncertain because depending on how you do this matching, the results can be all over the place, even worse than with choosing a certain distribution for a survival extrapolation. I mean, just leaving out 2 or 3 variables from your matching, from your propensity score matching model, for instance, could already have a large impact on the results of your economic model at the end. So we do look at them, we do consider the uncertainty, we try to communicate this uncertainty as good as we can, and we try to give this as a recommendation to the Ministry of Health, as in, watch out, this is very uncertain since it's based on a single arm trial. Please try to negotiate further than only getting this ICER under a certain reference value, because even the ICER that you have now is already very, very uncertain.
Okay, nice. I think we have time for one last question from us. I'd like to know about you guys, how you are dealing with and how you are kind of, what is the expectancy to use more real world data? So this kind of, here in the department, there's a lot of people doing research with real world data, but I would like to hear more about you guys. If you are using, considering, during the decisions, how do you perceive the use of real world data?
Shall I start maybe, and then Jelle can continue? Honestly, we usually, for the assessments of these dossiers and of these trials, we usually only look at published effectiveness data from clinical trials. In some instances, we have also observational data, but this also gets penalized already in such a way that in some cases, the effectiveness cannot be proven, and then it will not continue throughout our reimbursement procedure. Real-world data can be used, but not necessarily to claim a certain effectiveness, but it can be used within the assessment and for us as well to validate information, to validate evidence, and obviously I'm talking about effectiveness now, but when I talk about cost effectiveness, it also can be used to validate the model, to use some input parameters and so on and so forth. So with cost effectiveness, we're a little bit less strict, but with effectiveness, it should be a trial ideally published in a scientific journal and has been assessed and so on and so forth, peer-reviewed. But real-world evidence has honestly, everyone talks about real-world evidence as in being the next gold standard, but also we need all these repositories and all these registries because that's real world and that's what happens in the real world. But until now, I have not seen any good initiative in practice that has been used in practice by a certain, at least by the Dutch government, not really from what I'm aware of. There are various registries that are in place that gather data, but we can look at them, but eventually in decision making, their value is not that much used. But I can imagine that, for instance, for managed entry agreements, if you ask a certain company to give you information over the real life situation over time, that you could use that for your next negotiation. But maybe Jelle has some experience with this or already knows some initiatives in place.
Very limited. I agree with your assessment, Mohamed, but I think it's also an interesting point about the real-world data is that with trials being the golden standard, it's hard to deny those results because they're based on the latest clinical and research standards. It's usually paid for by the company, and if Mohamed and colleagues trust this information, then we'll do the same. What happens with real-world evidence is that it's more easily disputed. And in a negotiation, in my limited experience, if it's there and it's in the company's interest, then they will gladly share it with you. if it's not in the company's interest, they'll ignore it or they'll criticize it. And I think there's a very interesting dynamic going on in the Netherlands where we have expensive, widely applied treatments, where the health insurance companies have initiated research into dose lowering, where they find that similar results can be achieved by using less of a certain pharmaceutical. And this is being heavily criticized within the pharmaceutical industry, on television, on the news. And I think it will not take long before these type of cases will be taken to court. So there's evidence, and then there's the willingness to accept evidence.
Okay, nice. I think it was a great discussion. Ivan, if you want to say something to close, but I think we need to finish. Okay, so Mohamed, thanks again, Jelle. It was nice meeting you, even though it's online. But yeah, I think it was a nice discussion and interaction. I need to say some words in Portuguese, so sorry. But pessoal, queria agradecer a participação de todos. Acho que as perguntas foram bastante interessantes. A gente conseguiu aproveitar o período de 2 horas, que era a nossa proposta, assim, de modo intenso. E espero que essa interação tenha sido aí legal para vocês, enfim, seja no contexto do Ministério, dos NATs, and Mohamed and Jelle, of course, the invitation to go to Brazil, it's open, so yeah, I have a lot of possibilities, so please send us a message if you like to visit our country, so yeah. Então vamos finalizar por agora. E aí deixar avisado para todos que assim que a gente tiver o canal no YouTube do nosso curso da especialização, a gente vai disponibilizar para aqueles que não conseguiram participar hoje, assistir às palestras. Então é isso. Boa tarde para todo mundo aí, bom dia. See you, Jelle, Mohamed. Thanks again.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo and Ivan and the rest. See you next year in Brazil, maybe.
Yeah, that's it. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.